I invite you to open your Bibles to Luke's Gospel, the 22nd chapter. Luke 22, if you're reaching for a pew Bible, page 1569. Luke 22 contains Luke's telling of the last night before Jesus' crucifixion. It is a night he shares with his disciples in an upper room. This night is the Passover meal. Passover, that meal of such deep and great symbolism in Judaism, the history of their people. Though they don't realize it yet, the disciples that night will be part of a hinge in history. The hinge that swings between back then and Exodus and Passover and swings toward up there, new kingdom, Christ coming. Christ has yearned to share this meal with them. We're going to read that here in Luke's Gospel. He has had this deep, passionate desire to have this experience with them before he suffers. But other things are in the air on this night as well. I want to read two brief pieces of Luke's description of that night to get a sense of what was going on there. The first one is a piece that underlines his desire to be with his disciples. Luke 22, I begin reading in verse 14, and Luke writes this: When the hour came, Jesus and his apostles reclined at the table, and he said to them, I have eagerly desired, the wording there is very strong, I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I tell you, I will not eat it again until it finds fulfillment in the kingdom of God. He looks at that small group gathered around him. He knows that the morrow will hold very dark deeds. And he says to them, I have yearned for this moment, this time when we can be together before I suffer. Now he will have something else to say, which we will read in just a moment. But there are some important things that happen between the two. By the time he makes the next statement that we will read, they will have eaten the Passover meal. There will have been a conflict amongst the disciples regarding who will be first in this kingdom that has first surged and then it has waned. They will have come close to the moment when they're about to exit the upper room to go to what awaits Jesus. By the time he speaks these other words, interesting things have happened. Because though Jesus feels heavy with a knowledge of what is to come, the disciples apparently do not. Because they become involved in a discussion. I'm being kind to call it a discussion. It's a debate, it's a fight, it's elbowing between them regarding who will be first in the kingdom to come. In other words, they all see themselves as so gifted, as so talented, as so able, that each one of them believes, I will be the first. If I could put words in their mouth, their attitude would say this: Jesus, you're lucky to have me. In fact, you're lucky to have all of us. We're so good, we're not even sure who to put first. Now remember where this happens. This happens in the context of the table of the Lord. I understand it's been the Passover meal up to this point. Jesus is just now transforming it. But nevertheless, that's where it happens. Now, with that in mind, recognizing their fight to be in first place, recognizing that each of them seem to think, I am good enough to be at the top, then we ought to be surprised about another thing Jesus says that night. It's something that he feels so deeply that he will say to the disciples, I have prayed about this for you. So back to Luke 22 we go. This time we begin reading in verse 31, where Jesus is speaking to Peter. Now he will use his name Simon, his first name, Simon Peter. It seems to be Luke's preferred way of referring to Peter. But Jesus is now speaking to Peter after all these other things have transpired. Notice what he says in verse 31. Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift all of you as wheat. But I have prayed for you, Simon, that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. Remember the setting. Jesus, you're really lucky to have us. Any one of us could be the leader, but I really think, in all fairness, it should be me. I should come first. They are feeling that. They are fighting about that. When Jesus turns to Peter and says, let me tell you what's going on here. Satan has desired to sift you as wheat. It's a metaphor by which Jesus is saying, Satan wants to put you through such difficult trials that your true colors will be shown because he believes your true colors are dark. Not the gifted leaders you seem to think you are, but dark sinners. Now, I find that arresting. I find it arresting because of the context in which it occurs. It occurs in the context of this sacred meal. Now, you have to remember that this meal was so sacred that as the centuries would unfold in Christian history, it became a very exclusive kind of meal. At times reserved only for members of the clergy. Even when Protestantism broke open the doors to everyone, there was still for many a certain sense of dread when they approached the table of the Lord. It was so holy. Some grew up believing, grew up thinking, if there is any part of me that is unworthy, then to come and to eat and to drink from this place will be eating and drinking damnation to my soul. A lot of fear. And yet Jesus, in the context of that meal, by his words says, I know who's around this table. I know very well what's in your hearts. I know the selfishness. I know the sin that lurks there ready to be unleashed in just a few hours. And yet still, I welcome you at my table. I find that arresting. That Jesus would welcome sinners. Maybe that's why I'm so caught by the 6-word dictum of David Watson, who put it this way. This meal, he was referring to the Lord's table, this meal is for sinners only. It is an exclusive table. But its exclusivity is different than many have thought. This meal is for sinners only. Now, when you hear that, I guess the question is obvious. Does that include you or exclude you? Now, before you answer too quickly, maybe a story would help. It's a story told by author Kent Hughes in one of his books. Hughes says it happened in England. It was a large church, a very well-to-do church, highly educated church. In fact, the people in this particular congregation, said Hughes, were known for doing very well in the society, in the business world, in the spiritual religious realm. It was a strong, solid church of strong, good people. Now, they had some means, and so they had spawned some other churches, 3 mission churches to be specific, in some of the other parts of the city. Some of the parts of the city where people didn't experience some of the material blessings that the members here had. And one year they decided they would start first weekend worship service of the year by drawing all the churches together. Their own church, their 3 mission churches, all 4 of them would come together and would experience a Lord's table together. A weekend came and the church was packed. In that particular tradition, when it came time to receive the emblems, people came and knelt at the communion rail. It was then that the pastor happened to look down along those kneeling at the communion rail and see 2 people kneeling side by side that he thought, now that's very curious, that those 2 people should kneel here side by side. One was a member of that mother church, that congregation. He was a judge, highly respected, not just in his church, but highly respected in the society because he sat on the high court. Well-educated, refined gentleman. And there he knelt. Next to him knelt a gentleman from one of the mission churches, also quite well known. Well known because of the dastardly deeds he had committed. Well known because he had gone to prison. Well known because now he was an ex-convict. Well known because that judge beside whom he knelt had sent him to prison. And the pastor looked and thought, my, look at those two kneeling together. And the service unfolded. Church ended that day and people scattered to their homes. A few lingered to talk. The pastor, leaving a bit after the service, happened to fall in step with the judge. They walked out of the church down the street together, and as they walked, the pastor couldn't help but make a comment. Judge, he said, I was struck this morning. Struck when I looked down and saw somebody kneeling beside you at the communion rail. Do you know who was beside you? And the judge said, yes, I know. I'm very well aware. And they walked for a moment in silence. And then the judge said, as I was kneeling there, I thought, how amazing is the grace of God. And the pastor said, oh yes, Judge, I agree. It is truly amazing to think that the grace of God would bring him here to kneel beside you. And the judge said, yes, God's grace is great. But that's not what I was thinking. Oh? No, he said, I wasn't thinking about the grace of God in his life, but the grace of God in mine. I'm not sure I understand, asked the pastor. Well, said the judge, you see, he knew he needed God. I mean, let's be clear. He absolutely knew that. He grew up in a very difficult setting, very difficult circumstances, made all the wrong choices in life, ended up on the wrong side of the law, ended up restrained in prison by the law. By the time he came out, there was nothing but the grace of God for him. His heart must have been yearning for something better. But me, said the judge, I grew up in a strong home. Good parents. They trained me to be polite, to be culturally refined, made certain I had an education, studied at Oxford, was admitted to the bar, appointed to the bench. I sit as a judge, respected by the entire country. He said, I knelt there beside him thinking, how amazing is the grace of God that he could overcome all that good and still manage to reach me. That story catches me because it says sometimes it is very hard to reach people who are in the pit of success. Jesus, you're lucky to have us. Look around this table. Any one of us could be the leader. Actually, I believe it should be me. That should be obvious to you, Jesus. But any one of us could do it. And the judge said, I'm awed by the grace of God that he could reach one who in his natural state feels no need. That grace just keeps coming. That story catches me because in this family that I love, we have many who understand the judge. Sure, life has had its hard times, its difficult twists and turns, but you've studied hard. You've worked hard. You've attained certain things. It feels good. I have followed that same pathway. And then we come to the supper table of the Lord, thinking we belong. This is where we ought to be. Jesus, you're lucky to have us. And Jesus says to Peter, this meal is for sinners only. It's exclusive. I mean, as I got to thinking about that, I got to thinking about baptisms here in our church congregation. I've thought about this many times when I've done the baptisms, when my colleagues do baptisms, particularly with young people. I've done it many times. We stand in the baptismal pool, grateful for the wonderful privilege. And we introduce this young person. She's a great student, effervescent spirit. Teachers love to see her come. And we do the baptism. I've had a twinge at times about that. But then one day, one of our congregation, grabbed me by the sleeve and said, Pastor, I notice how you all do these baptisms of these young people coming up. And I said, okay, what have you noticed? He said, wouldn't it be better to talk about their sin? I mean, after all, that's why they're in there, to be washed from their sin. I said, well, I suppose, what did you have in mind? Well, wouldn't it be better to stand there in the tank and say, this is Janie. Janie is an evil sinner. She's horrible. She cheats on occasion, lies at times, has a selfish heart. Her teachers dread seeing her coming. Thought, well, have you ever done a baptism? I mean, can you imagine Pastor Doug, our junior high pastor, standing in the waters and saying, this is Jane? Would all the family and friends of this vile sinner please stand and be recognized? Family, are you out there? You're out there somewhere. Stand. Did you not bring any family? It's an interesting reality. We come to these moments, and there is that temptation to think, life has been good. I've worked hard. I have a place at the table. And Jesus says, this meal is for sinners only. It's exclusive. But if you're a sinner, you are abundantly welcome. You can put your feet under the table anytime, because that's why the meal exists. I think sometimes it's easier for some to recognize that than it is for others. I look at my own life and I just pray, Jesus, save me from that pit called success that would have me thinking I belong, and remind me of the pinnacle of humility that says you belong here only because of my grace. This meal is for sinners only. But if you are a sinner, it is absolutely for you. He welcomes you here. And by this meal, you will be nourished. The Seventh-day Adventist Church practices an open communion. If you're a friend, if you're a guest, if you're a first-time visitor, we would love to have you participate with us. Now, we do it a bit differently than some. We begin by participating in that service of foot washing, spoken of by John in the 13th chapter of his gospel. That experience where Jesus washed their feet and then said to them, you will be happy if you do this. That foot washing was symbolic of things like humility and washing from the stain of sin. So So we will exit the sanctuary and go to the educational wing behind me or to your left. There are rooms for men, for women, and for families. We'll participate together. And then we will return having washed to participate in the supper table of the Lord. Now let me just ask you, if you're a member of this church family, would you keep your eyes open? Be aware of those around you. If there's a guest, a new visitor, a first-timer here that looks a bit uncertain, would you sweep them up into the embrace of the Loma Linda University Church and serve them as we participate together? So we'll dismiss from this place, wash, and then we will come to the supper table of the Lord.